The evening sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Church as the bride stood frozen in her white gown, watching her fiancé's back disappear through the heavy wooden doors. The gentle rustle of her dress seemed deafening in the shocked silence that followed. 300 pairs of eyes shifted between the empty doorway and the abandoned bride, their collective gasps echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Mrs. Chen, the elderly florist who had spent hours perfecting the pink and white roses adorning each pew, later told neighbors it was like watching a scene from a movie. The groom had been standing there one moment, hands clasped with his bride-to-be, and the next moment he was gone, leaving nothing but the lingering scent of his cologne and an unfinished I do. The bride's mother rushed forward, her navy dress swishing as she wrapped protective arms around her daughter. The father of the bride, still holding the wedding program in his trembling hands, looked as if he'd aged 10 years in those few seconds. The best man stood awkwardly at the altar, the rings burning a hole in his pocket, while the maid of honor's mascara-stained tears left black tracks down her cheeks. In the third row, the groom's parents sat mortified, his mother's face buried in her hands, while his father stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Their son, the successful young architect who had seemed so perfect on paper, had just become the talk of their small town. What none of the shell-shocked guests knew was that the couple had shared an intimate night just 2 weeks before the wedding. It had been a moment of passion after their final wedding planning meeting, fueled by champagne and the excitement of their approaching nuptials. The bride had kept a secret, though. She'd been undergoing fertility treatments, hoping to surprise her future husband with good news after the honeymoon. As the stunned congregation began to disperse, whispers filled the church. The organist, who had been midway through the wedding march, quietly closed his music book. The caterers in the reception hall next door began the sad task of wrapping up untouched appetizers and boxing a wedding cake that would never be cut. The bride's younger sister found her in the church bathroom later, still in her wedding dress, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her carefully crafted makeup remained perfect, but her eyes held 1,000 questions. "I don't understand," she whispered, fingers tracing the delicate lace on her sleeve. "Everything was perfect. We were perfect." That evening, as the sun set on what should have been the happiest day of her life, the bride sat in her childhood bedroom, still wearing her wedding dress. She couldn't bring herself to take it off just yet. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from concerned friends and family, but she couldn't look at them. Instead, she thought about the moments leading up to the disaster, how her almost husband had seemed nervous but not unusually so, how he had smiled at her as she walked down the aisle, how his hands had been warm when he took hers. The next morning's local paper would carry the story on its front page, not because failed weddings were news, but because the groom was from one of the town's most prominent families. His face would be splashed across the local news websites, and social media would buzz with speculation. But in that moment, in her quiet bedroom surrounded by the remnants of her wedding day, the bride had no idea that this was just the beginning of a story that would shake their small community to its core. What the runaway groom didn't know, as he drove his sports car across state lines that evening, was that his hasty departure would have consequences far beyond a ruined wedding. The intimate night they'd shared would prove to be more significant than either of them could have imagined, setting in motion a chain of events that would eventually bring them back together in the most unexpected way. As darkness fell over the town, the bride finally slipped out of her wedding dress, carefully hanging it in her closet. She wouldn't know for several more weeks that she was already carrying not one, but 4 tiny lives within her, a twist of fate that would eventually force the runaway groom to face both his responsibilities and his fears. The church custodian, sweeping up rose petals late that night, shook his head at the irony of it all. In his 30 years of maintaining the church, he'd seen his share of wedding day dramas, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the way the bride had held her head high as she finally walked out, or maybe it was the look in the groom's eyes just before he fled. Either way, he had a feeling this wasn't the end of their story. Little did anyone know, the real story was just beginning, and the whole town would soon be caught up in a tale that would make the failed wedding seem like just the opening act. 3 weeks after the disastrous wedding day, the bride sat nervously in her doctor's waiting room. The morning sickness that had started a few days ago wasn't letting up, and her mother had finally convinced her to get checked out. She thumbed through an old magazine, not really reading it, while trying to ignore the sympathetic glances from other patients who recognized her from the local news coverage. The nurse called her name with a gentle smile, leading her to the examination room. "Just routine blood work," she assured her, noting how the young woman's hands trembled slightly. What should have been a simple checkup turned into a moment that would change everything. When the doctor returned with the test results, her expression was a mixture of surprise and concern. "You might want to sit down for this," she said, pulling up her chair. "You're pregnant." The bride's world stopped for a moment, but the doctor wasn't finished. "And based on these hormone levels, we need to do an ultrasound right away." The cold gel on her stomach felt surreal as the ultrasound technician moved the wand carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. The room was silent except for the steady whooshing sounds from the machine. Then the technician's eyes widened. She called in the doctor, who studied the screen intently before turning to her patient with an astonished expression. "I'm seeing 4 distinct heartbeats," the doctor said carefully, watching her patient's face. "You're carrying quadruplets." The bride's mind raced back to the fertility treatments she'd undergone months ago, treatments she'd kept secret, hoping to surprise her future husband after the wedding. The doctors had warned her about the possibility of multiple pregnancies, but quadruplets. The room seemed to spin. Her mother, who had been waiting outside, burst into tears when she heard the news. 4 babies, she kept repeating, holding her daughter's hand. The bride sat in shocked silence, her free hand resting on her still flat stomach, trying to comprehend that 4 tiny lives were growing inside her. The next few hours were a blur of medical terminology, appointments being scheduled, and pamphlets being thrust into her hands. High-risk pregnancy, specialized care, potential complications. The words swirled around her like autumn leaves in a windstorm. Back home that evening, she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the prenatal vitamin prescriptions and information packets the doctor had given her. Her sister brought over dinner, but she could barely eat. The reality of her situation was slowly sinking in. She was going to be a mother of 4, and she was going to do it alone. Or was she? The question of whether to tell the father weighed heavily on her mind. He had walked away from their wedding, yes, but didn't he have a right to know? And more practically, could she really handle 4 babies on her own? Her best friend came over later that night with ice cream and a shoulder to cry on. They sat on the couch, talking through options until the early hours of the morning. "You need to think about the practical side of things," her friend advised gently. 4 babies means 4 of everything. 4 cribs, 4 car seats, 4 college funds. The next morning, scrolling through her phone, she came across a social media post about her ex-fiancé. He was back in town, apparently, having returned to his job at the prestigious architecture firm. The sight of his face made her stomach clench, or maybe that was just the morning sickness kicking in again. She spent the next few days in a daze, going through the motions at her job as an elementary school teacher, trying to focus on her students while her mind kept wandering to the 4 tiny heartbeats she'd seen on the ultrasound screen. Her colleagues noticed her distraction but attributed it to post-wedding trauma. Nobody knew her earth-shattering secret yet. But secrets have a way of coming out, especially in small towns. The first hint came when a patient from the OB/GYN's office recognized her and mentioned it to her hairdresser. The hairdresser told her sister, who told her best friend, who happened to work at the same coffee shop as the runaway groom's cousin. Within days, whispers about the quadruplets were spreading through town like wildfire. The bride knew she had to take control of the narrative before it spiraled out of control. She also knew she needed to think about the future. Her medical bills were already mounting, and she was only at the beginning of what promised to be a very expensive and complicated pregnancy. That evening, as she sat in her small home office looking at her budget spreadsheet, she made a decision. Tomorrow, she would contact a family law attorney. Her babies deserve support from both parents, whether their father was ready for the responsibility or not. She placed her hand on her stomach, feeling stronger than she had in weeks. "Don't worry, little ones," she whispered. "We're going to figure this out together." The news broke on a quiet Tuesday morning. The runaway groom was sipping his morning coffee at his desk, scrolling through local news on his phone, when he saw the headline that made him choke on his drink. "Local teacher expecting quadruplets after wedding day abandonment." His coffee cup clattered against the saucer as his hands began to shake. The article was everywhere, Local news websites, social media, even the morning radio shows were discussing it. His phone started buzzing with messages from friends and family who had seen the news. His new girlfriend, whom he'd started dating just 2 weeks after leaving his bride at the altar, peered over his shoulder at the article. "That's impossible," she declared, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against his phone screen. "She must be making it up for attention. There's no way those babies are yours." But deep down, he knew better. The timeline matched perfectly with their last night together before the wedding. He remembered that evening clearly, the champagne, the excitement, the passion. Now that passionate moment was about to turn his carefully reconstructed life upside down. His co-workers at the architecture firm were obviously discussing the news. He could hear their whispers, see them quickly dispersing whenever he walked by. The story was spreading like wildfire through their small town, and he was once again the center of attention. But this time, the gossip was far worse than just being known as the man who left his bride at the altar. During lunch, his mother called. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice tight with emotion. "Are you going to be a father? To 4 babies?" When he couldn't give her a straight answer, she hung up with a disappointed sigh that reminded him of his childhood days. The local coffee shop, where he usually grabbed his afternoon espresso, suddenly felt hostile. The barista who had always flirted with him now barely made eye contact. An elderly couple who had been guests at the failed wedding got up and left when he walked in. His comfortable world was crumbling around him. His new girlfriend insisted he make a public statement denying paternity. "Just say it's impossible," she urged over dinner that evening. "Say you were careful. Say she's lying." But even as she spoke, he could see doubt creeping into her eyes. Their relationship, built on the shaky foundation of his escape from commitment, was already showing cracks. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself looking at old photos on his phone. Pictures of him and his ex-fiancée laughing, planning their future, looking so happy. He remembered how she had always wanted children, how her face lit up around babies. Had she known about the pregnancy at the wedding? Was that why she had seemed so radiant that day? The next morning brought more surprises. His ex-fiancée's lawyer had released a statement confirming the pregnancy and announcing their intention to pursue legal action for prenatal support. The document mentioned medical bills, preparations for 4 babies, and the need for immediate financial assistance. His own lawyer called an emergency meeting. "This is serious," the attorney warned, shuffling through papers. "Quadruplets are high risk. The medical expenses alone could be astronomical. And if these are your children, you're looking at 18 years of support, times 4. Social media was brutal. His professional profile was flooded with negative comments. Someone had even created a meme of him running from the church with 4 baby carriages chasing him. It would have been funny if it wasn't so painfully real. His father, a respected businessman in town, called to tell him the country club was considering revoking his membership. "Fix this," his father demanded. "Either prove they're not yours or step up and take responsibility. This family can't handle any more scandal." The new girlfriend left him that evening, saying she didn't sign up for all this drama. As he watched her walk away, he realized how quickly his carefully constructed new life was falling apart. The comfortable bubble he built after running from his wedding had finally burst. Sitting alone in his modern apartment, surrounded by architectural drawings and design awards, he faced the reality he'd been avoiding. 4 babies. 4 human beings who, if they were his, would depend on him for the next 2 decades. The thought terrified him more than any deadline or client meeting ever had. As he stared at his reflection in the window, he saw what everyone else in town was seeing, not the successful young architect, but the man who might have abandoned not just his bride, but his unborn children. The weight of his actions, and their potential consequences, finally began to sink in. Tomorrow, he would have to make a decision. He could fight the paternity claims, hire expensive lawyers, and try to maintain his denial. Or he could face the responsibility he'd been running from, not just to his ex-fiancée, but possibly to 4 innocent lives who never asked to be part of this complicated situation. Outside his window, the town continued its normal evening routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. His world had shifted on its axis, and this time, running away wasn't going to be an option. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters on the morning of the first hearing. The bride's attorney, A sharp-dressed woman known for handling high-profile family cases arrived first, carrying a thick folder of medical documentation. The pregnant teacher followed, now showing slightly at 12 weeks, surrounded by a protective circle of family members. The runaway groom arrived minutes later, his own legal team flanking him. Dark circles under his eyes suggested sleepless nights, and his usually immaculate suit looked slightly rumpled. The small-town courthouse had never seen such attention. Local news vans lined the street, and curious onlookers gathered behind hastily erected barriers. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. The judge, a veteran of family court who thought she'd seen everything, raised her eyebrows as she reviewed the case details. 4 heartbeats flickered on the ultrasound images submitted as evidence, clear as day. "Your Honor," the bride's attorney began, her voice steady and clear, "my client is carrying quadruplets, a high-risk pregnancy requiring specialized medical care. The defendant's paternity is clear based on the conception date, and we're seeking immediate support for essential prenatal care and preparation for the baby's arrival." The groom's legal team countered with questions about the fertility treatments. "Your Honor, our client was never informed about these medical interventions. He had no knowledge of the possibility of multiple births. We request full disclosure of all medical records and question the timing of these treatments." The bride sat quietly, hands folded protectively over her growing belly as her private medical history was discussed in the crowded courtroom. Her mother squeezed her hand supportively as the lawyers argued about dates, medical procedures, and financial responsibilities. Medical experts were called to testify about the risks and costs associated with a quadruplet pregnancy. The statistics were sobering: the likelihood of complications, the need for frequent monitoring, the possibility of extended hospital stays. The estimated costs made everyone in the courtroom wince. During a brief recess, the bride's attorney pulled her aside. "They're going to demand a paternity test," she warned. "But we can't do invasive testing until after the births. It's too risky with quadruplets. We'll have to rely on the timeline and documentation for now." Back in session, the groom's attorney presented social media posts and text messages, trying to create doubt about the conception date. But the evidence was clear: the timeline matched perfectly with their last night together before the failed wedding. The judge interrupted the legal back and forth with pointed questions about practical matters. These babies could arrive early. Who will cover the NICU costs if needed? What about the immediate needs? 4 cribs, 4 car seats, medical equipment. These decisions can't wait for a lengthy legal battle. The bride's doctor testified about the unique challenges of carrying quadruplets. "Each week brings new risks," she explained. "My patient needs reduced work hours, regular specialized care, and possible bed rest in the coming months. These aren't optional expenses, they're medical necessities." In the gallery, the groom's parents sat stiffly, their faces unreadable. His mother dabbed at her eyes occasionally with a monogrammed handkerchief. They had always prided themselves on their family's reputation in town, and now their social circles were buzzing with this unprecedented situation. The bride's younger sister took the stand next, describing how her sibling could barely work full-time anymore due to severe morning sickness and fatigue. "She's trying to save every penny for the babies," she testified, "but her teacher's salary barely covers her regular expenses, let alone preparing for 4 newborns." Financial experts presented calculations for the cost of raising quadruplets, from immediate medical needs through college education. The numbers were staggering, causing murmurs throughout the courtroom. The groom loosened his tie, looking increasingly uncomfortable. As the hearing progressed, the judge's patience with the groom's attempts to avoid responsibility visibly thinned. "These children, if they are yours, and the timeline strongly suggests they are, will need support regardless of how you feel about the circumstances of their conception." The bride's attorney presented a proposed support schedule, breaking down immediate needs, medical care, maternity leave coverage, essential baby equipment times 4. The groom's lawyer objected to nearly every line item, leading to detailed discussions about the cost of high-end baby monitors versus basic models, and whether designer baby clothes were really necessary. Near the end of the day, the judge called both parties to the bench for a private conference. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as they spoke in hushed tones. Whatever was said made the groom's face pale considerably. As the sun began to set outside the courthouse windows, the judge made her initial ruling. Temporary support would begin immediately, pending final paternity confirmation after the births. The groom would be responsible for medical costs and essential preparations for the baby's arrival. The bride left the courthouse looking relieved but exhausted, while the groom remained behind with his legal team, presumably discussing their next move. Neither spoke to the waiting reporters, but their expressions said enough. This was just the beginning of a long and complex legal journey. That evening, as the town buzzed with news of the hearing, 4 tiny hearts continued beating, blissfully unaware of the drama surrounding their existence. The legal battle for their future was just beginning, but at least now there was a framework in place to ensure their basic needs would be met. As weeks passed, the story of the quadruplets and the runaway groom took on a life of its own. Social media erupted with support for the expecting mother, while the groom's reputation crumbled like autumn leaves. His architecture firm's review page was flooded with negative comments, forcing them to temporarily disable their social media accounts. The pregnant teacher, now in her 2nd trimester, became something of a local celebrity. Students' parents would stop her in the grocery store, offering help and sharing their own twin or triplet stories. The local bakery started selling Quad Squad cookies, donating a portion of the proceeds to a fund for the babies. Meanwhile, the groom's business suffered. Clients began canceling contracts, politely citing other arrangements. His once bustling office grew quieter. Even his regular coffee shop, where he'd been a fixture for years, seemed less welcoming. The baristas no longer remembered his usual order, and other customers would whisper behind their hands when he walked in. Former wedding guests started coming forward with stories. The owner of the bridal shop revealed how he'd seemed distant during planning meetings. The wedding photographer shared how he'd appeared anxious during their engagement photo session, constantly checking his phone. A pattern emerged of a man who'd shown signs of flight long before he actually ran. The bride's story resonated particularly strongly with the town's mothers. They organized meal trains and baby clothing drives. Her small apartment began filling with hand-knitted blankets and tiny homemade booties, 4 of everything, each set more adorable than the last. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the challenges of carrying quadruplets. The article detailed the bride's daily struggles, teaching while dealing with extreme fatigue, preparing for 4 babies on a single income, facing the possibility of extended bed rest. The comments section overflowed with supportive messages and offers of help. The groom's parents, once pillars of local society, found themselves increasingly isolated. Their country club friends made excuses to cancel dinner plans. Their church pew, traditionally filled with well-wishers each Sunday, sat emptier than usual. Their son's actions had cast a shadow over their carefully maintained social standing. A turning point came when the bride's doctor ordered her to reduce her teaching hours due to health concerns. The local parent-teacher association organized a fundraiser, and the response was overwhelming. Meanwhile, the groom's attempt to join a prestigious architectural society was quietly declined, citing character concerns. The town's divide became clear at local gatherings. At the annual Harvest Festival, people would cross the street to hug the pregnant teacher, while awkwardly avoiding eye contact with the groom's family. His sister overheard whispers at her yoga class about her brother's terrible behavior and stopped attending. Social media played a huge role in shaping public opinion. A local mommy blogger wrote a viral post about the situation, drawing parallels to her own experience as a single mother. The post was shared thousands of times, reaching far beyond their small town's borders. National parenting websites picked up the story, turning it into a discussion about responsibility and commitment. The groom's professional reputation continued to suffer. At a regional architects' conference, colleagues who had once sought his mentorship now kept their distance. His presentation on sustainable design, usually a highlight of the event, saw noticeably lower attendance than previous years. Former wedding guests continued sharing their perspectives. The videographer released a short clip from the wedding preparations, showing the bride's joy as she prepared for what she thought would be the happiest day of her life. The contrast with current events pulled at viewers' heartstrings. The local high school, where the bride taught, showed remarkable support. Students organized a 4 times the love campaign, creating handmade cards and small gifts for the future babies. The school board approved a modified teaching schedule to accommodate her medical needs. As the pregnancy progressed, the town's investment in the story deepened. Local businesses began offering discounts on baby items, competing to show their support. A furniture store donated 4 cribs, making sure to announce their generosity on social media. The contrast between community support and the groom's continued resistance became increasingly stark. The groom's attempts to maintain his normal routine became nearly impossible. His favorite restaurants suddenly became fully booked when he tried to make reservations. His regular gym changed its class schedule, conflicting with his preferred workout times. Small, subtle changes that added up to a clear message. The town had chosen sides. Through it all, the bride maintained her dignity, focusing on her health and the 4 tiny lives growing inside her. Her quiet strength in the face of adversity only served to highlight the groom's perceived cowardice, turning public opinion even further against him. As the legal proceedings continued, the court of public opinion had already reached its verdict. The story had evolved beyond a simple tale of abandonment into a broader discussion about responsibility, community, and consequences. The groom's attempt to escape commitment had ironically made him more notorious than he could have ever imagined. The courthouse was unusually crowded that morning for what was supposed to be a routine procedural hearing. The bride, now 7 months pregnant and noticeably carrying quadruplets, waddled carefully through the security checkpoint, supported by her mother and sister. The groom sat at the defendant's table, reviewing documents with his lawyer. Nobody expected what happened next. Halfway through the judge's questions about upcoming medical expenses, the bride suddenly gripped her stomach, her face contorting in pain. The court reporter noticed first, her fingers freezing over her stenotype machine. Then the bride's mother's voice cut through the legal discussions. Her water just broke. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Someone called 911 while the judge quickly cleared the gallery. The groom stood frozen, watching as his ex-fiancée breathed heavily through contractions that weren't supposed to start for another 2 months. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was clear the babies weren't going to wait. The courthouse's marble halls echoed with urgent voices as medical equipment was rushed in. The judge's chambers became an impromptu delivery room, the closest private space available. The bride's doctor, who had been present to testify about medical costs, took charge of the situation. "These babies are coming now," she announced, her voice calm but firm. "We need to prepare for an emergency delivery." In the midst of the commotion, the groom found himself pulled into the makeshift delivery room. "She's asking for you," the nurse said, her grip on his arm surprisingly strong. Before he could process what was happening, he was standing beside the woman he'd left at the altar, watching her fight through contractions. The next 2 hours were a blur of medical terminology, urgent instructions, and the bride's determined efforts to bring 4 new lives into the world. The groom, who had spent months trying to distance himself from the situation, found himself holding her hand as she pushed, his expensive suit jacket now serving as a makeshift pillow. The first baby arrived with a strong cry that echoed through the judge's chambers. A boy, tiny but fierce, his protests at entering the world early bringing tears to everyone's eyes. The second followed quickly. Another boy, smaller than his brother but equally vocal. The third baby, a girl, needed some extra help from the medical team, causing tense moments before her first cry pierced the air. The fourth, another girl, arrived last, completing the quartet that had turned their lives upside down. The groom, who had been so adamant about denying his connection to these children, found himself counting fingers and toes along with the medical team. 4 perfect, tiny humans, each weighing less than 4 pounds, each bearing an unmistakable resemblance to both their parents. The courthouse hallways, usually filled with legal arguments and procedural discussions, now echoed with the cries of newborns. 4 ambulances arrived to transport the babies to the NICU, their sirens creating a symphony that would be talked about in town for years to come. As the medical team prepared the babies for transport, the groom caught his reflection in the window. His carefully maintained facade had crumbled. His tie was loose, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes held a look of wonder he couldn't hide. The judge, who had witnessed the entire scene from the corner of her chambers, made notes on her legal pad. The man who had run from commitment was now helping count preemie diapers and listening intently to NICU procedures. Sometimes, she mused, life had its own way of delivering justice. Before the babies were taken to the hospital, the bride reached for the groom's hand one more time. No words were exchanged, but something shifted in that moment. The legal battle that had consumed them seemed suddenly less important than the 4 tiny lives they had created. The courthouse steps, where reporters had gathered hoping for updates on the legal proceedings, instead became the scene of an impromptu press conference about the surprise births. The court clerk, still in shock, found herself announcing birth weights and times to the assembled crowd. That evening, as 4 incubators in the NICU housed the newest members of their community, the story spread through town. The courthouse births became instant local legend, with every witness adding their own details to the tale. The groom's carefully constructed defenses had been shattered by 4 pairs of tiny fingers and 4 button noses. As he stood outside the NICU that night, watching his children through the window, he finally understood that some things were bigger than fear, bigger than running away. The legal paperwork would wait. Tonight was about 4 miraculous lives that had chosen their own perfect moment to arrive, turning a courtroom into a delivery room and a reluctant father into a dad. The weeks following the courthouse births transformed both parents in ways nobody expected. The groom, who had once fallen from commitment, now spent hours in the NICU, learning to change tiny diapers and master the art of feeding 4 babies simultaneously. The nurses watched in amazement as the man who had made headlines for running away became a fixture in the unit, arriving each morning with coffee for the staff and determination in his eyes. The bride's hospital room became an unofficial meeting place for lawyers, family members, and medical staff. Instead of arguing over support payments, they found themselves discussing feeding schedules and the logistics of caring for 4 premature babies. The legal battle that had consumed them all seemed insignificant compared to the challenge of ensuring 4 tiny lives thrived. 3 weeks after their dramatic arrival, the first baby, the firstborn son, was strong enough to leave the NICU. His parents found themselves working together to prepare for his homecoming, awkwardly navigating their new reality. The groom's architectural skills came in handy as they planned the nursery layout to eventually accommodate all 4 babies. The second son followed a week later, then the girls, one by one, each homecoming a celebration of progress and possibility. The local community, which had been divided by the scandal, united in support of the young family. Meal trains were organized, volunteer schedules were created, and the town's best pediatrician made house calls without being asked. The groom's parents, who had been embarrassed by their son's actions, found redemption in their role as grandparents. His mother, once preoccupied with social standing, now proudly wheeled a quad stroller through town, stopping to share photos with anyone who showed interest. 6 months after the courthouse births, the legal proceedings finally concluded. The settlement wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It had evolved into a comprehensive parenting plan that put the quadruplets' needs first. The judge, who had witnessed their arrival, smiled as she signed the final documents. The bride returned to teaching part-time, a classroom now decorated with 4 matching photo frames showing her children's progress. Her students were fascinated by the babies, and parent-teacher conferences often included updates about the quadruplets' latest achievements. The groom's architecture firm, which had suffered during the scandal, found unexpected success designing a revolutionary nursery layout for multiple births. His experience as a quad dad led to innovations in space-saving furniture and practical baby room design. Other parents of multiples sought his expertise, turning a personal challenge into a professional opportunity. Their co-parenting relationship, while not romantic, developed into a strong partnership. They learned to coordinate schedules, share responsibilities, and celebrate their children's milestones together. Family dinners became a weekly tradition, with both sets of grandparents taking turns hosting the growing family. The town's annual harvest festival that year featured 4 tiny grand marshals in their custom wagon, their parents walking alongside, sharing proud smiles as their children waved to the crowd. The same community that had witnessed their wedding day disaster now celebrated their success as parents. As the quadruplets grew, their personalities emerged, each unique, yet carrying traces of both parents. The firstborn son had his father's analytical mind, the second his mother's gentle spirit. One daughter inherited her dad's creativity, while her sister showed her mom's determination. The groom's fear of commitment gradually transformed into a deep dedication to his children. He never returned to the man who ran from responsibility. Instead, he became known as the father who juggled 4 babies while attending business meetings via video call, who designed a revolutionary baby care app, and who never missed a pediatrician appointment. The bride found strength she never knew she had, managing 4 different schedules while maintaining her career and sense of self. Her story inspired other single mothers, not because of the drama that preceded it, but because of the grace with which she handled every challenge. Their story became less about the wedding day disaster and more about the unexpected journey that followed. The courthouse births, once a scandal, were now celebrated as the moment that changed everything. The day fear gave way to love, and running away was no longer an option. As the quadruplets approached their first birthday, both parents sat together planning the celebration. Looking at their children, healthy, happy, and loved, they realized that sometimes life's biggest mistakes can lead to its greatest blessings. The groom who left his bride at the altar had become a devoted father, and the abandoned bride had become a stronger woman than she ever imagined. Their story taught their small town about forgiveness, growth, and the unexpected ways life can bring people together. The Quad Squad, as they were affectionately known, became symbols of hope, proof that even the most dramatic beginnings can lead to beautiful endings.